Over the years, when I was involved with the original Xbox and Xbox 360 homebrew scenes, I worked on many ports. Most of them were released to the public, and I made a video about how I got into the original Xbox homebrew scene and the ports that I worked on back then. But there were some failed attempts of stuff that I worked on that I felt wasn't good enough to release. So join me while I boot up some of my old dev kits and take a second look at my unreleased ports that never made the cut. When I first started coding for the Xbox 360, there was already a port of MAME that was released known as MAME 360. While it ran okay, it was slower than I expected, and I wasn't sure why. I just figured it was a quick, unoptimized port. Now, I mentioned in a previous video that Capcom CPS 3 and the Midway T-Unit hardware such as Mortal Kombat 2 and NBA Jam is a good measure of performance. Generally speaking, both of these drivers struggle with slower processors. MAME stands for the Multi-Arcade Machine Emulator, and it's been around for many years, and it's been ported to just about every single device you could think of. Now, unfortunately, MAME over the years has sacrificed performance for emulation. In other words, as more and more releases of MAME comes out, it seems to get slower and slower over time. And that means porting MAME to other systems other than a PC that doesn't have the ability to run a dynamic recompiler means it can get very slow. So usually what happens is authors that want to port MAME to other systems and consoles will typically go back many different revisions and find a sweet spot where you can get a good list of drivers and emulation as well as good level of performance. But wait a second, an Xbox 360 has a 3.2 GHz processor and 6 hardware threads. On paper, MAME should run exceptionally fast. The problem with the Xbox 360 is the CPU was severely crippled to save on cost, and without optimization, the level of performance of a straight port can feel no faster than an original Xbox at times. Still, I felt like I could do a better MAME port than MAME 360. So my first attempt was to port the most current release of MAME at the time, which was SDL MAME 0.141. Now this wasn't a bad port at all, and it ran things okay, but my Midway T-Unit driver tests showed some significant drops in frames and in turn, choppy sound. Now I did some tweaks here and there, but I just couldn't get the FPS where I wanted it. So I decided to not release it. After that particular failed experiment, I forgot about MAME for a while and focused on Final Burn Alpha, or my port of FBA Next, which I spent months working on and fine-tuning, and it came out with a number of releases over an 18-month time frame. It ran CPS 3 really well, and I was very pleased with it, but FBA Next does not support Midway games, so I always thought about going back to MAME, with the goal to play Mortal Kombat 2 and other T-Unit and Wolf Unit games at 60 frames per second on the Xbox 360. So I went back and decided to port SDL MAME 0.136. Now I don't remember quite the reason why this version was special, but this one was also a failed experiment. It was certainly faster than my first attempt at 0.141, but it was still dropping frames, and again I decided it was best not to release it. The version that I ultimately settled on was MAME 0.72.
Round 1, fight!
Now this wasn't a random choice. The reason for the huge performance drops in MAME for Mortal Kombat 2 and other T-Unit games is to do with the sound emulation that Midway used. Known as DCS Sound, on earlier versions of MAME up to 0.72, it ran very fast due to a speed hack that was introduced by the MAME developers, but after 0.72, the DCS sound code was replaced with more accurate emulation in exchange for performance. Finally, I had a version of MAME working that I could play Midway games at excellent frame rates. But because MAME 0.72 was an old version, it couldn't play some of the more modern games. So one more unreleased port that I worked on was MAME 0.99 before the infamous 0.1 release. This version has newer drivers and supports things like PSX and Sega Model 1 games, but in the end, with software rendering and no dynamic recompiler, they were slow, and I left this version ultimately on the unreleased pile. One of the emulators that I spent a lot of time working on the Xbox 360 was DUSTBOX. Now DUSTBOX is the PC-based DOS emulator that's great for playing old DOS games from the 80s and 90s. DOSBox is a program which emulates an IBM PC-compatible computer running a DOS operating system. I released DOSBox for the Xbox 360 in 2011. It was pretty cool. Just plug in a keyboard into a USB port and your Xbox 360 is converted into a DOS gaming machine. However, I had a thirst for more performance in order to play some of the more advanced 3D games. The first port of DOSBox used SDL, and I planned a second release, so I stripped SDL away and rewrote the graphics library and incorporated pixel shaders. This gave me a small speed boost. Then I wrote my own dynamic recompiler for the PowerPC Xenon chip, and this is something that I've never done before. I spent maybe a month or so working on the Dynarec. However, the main reason for not releasing this was my dynamic recompiler ended up slower than the interpreted version, as you can see here. In the end, I decided against releasing this version to the public. Clearly, the Dynarec was not completed and still had a lot of work that needed to be done. And I came to the conclusion that the interpreted version was good enough to run most DOS games on the Xbox 360 anyway. Sometime in 2011 or 2012, there was a port to the original Xbox of a 3DO emulator known as FREEDO, and it was by a guy called Incrediclint, and he ended up releasing the source code for his port, which was based on FREEDO, which was the open source 3DO emulation library that was released by the original FREEDO authors back in the day. So Incrediclint had already worked on a port to the original Xbox and unfortunately did not run very well. And that's because the 3DO is a fairly demanding piece of hardware that has multiple custom chips, which is very difficult to emulate, especially on an original Xbox. But it was a pretty good emulation attempt, and it did run some things quite well, but unfortunately just didn't have the juice. The original Xbox didn't have the juice to really push it to the next level. So I took a look at Incrediclint's source code, and I felt like the 3DO could run quite well on the Xbox 360. I spent many hours working on a port of FREEDO, an open source 3DO emulator, to the Xbox 360. Initial performance wasn't very good, so I utilized the Xbox 360's hardware threads to separate out the graphics chips and sound, and this gave the emulator a nice performance boost. My original alpha version 0.03 was released in 2012, but I had an update in the works that you are seeing here, which is 0.04, that has many performance improvements. And there were two games in particular that did not run with the first alpha. They were Crash and Burn and Lucian's Quest. I also made updates to the graphics and sound as well as some more optimizations, but in the end I felt like this release wasn't really that much more of an improvement than the previous alpha. And while I did have plans to release this version, the sound was still being a problem. Never been so much fun. 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 Go to your brother, killing with your gun, taking lying in his uniform, dying in the sun. Redneck Rampage is a FPS that was released using the build engine by Ken Silverman, and it was the third game to utilize the build engine, the first being Duke Nukem 3D, and the second being Shadow Warrior. Now, Redneck Rampage became open source very quietly in 2011, and I decided to take a look at the source code and see if it was feasible to port it to the Xbox 360. eRampage is a free open source port intended to run the Redneck Rampage series. The source code for Redneck Rampage was released in 2010, and I decided to port it to the Xbox 360. It ended up running very well, and it even ran at a native 720p widescreen resolution. This one stayed unreleased, however, simply because many features were not implemented yet. As you can see, some enemies do not animate, nor did they have any game logic built into them. There were many examples like this, and in turn ended up having some game-breaking issues. I had hopes that the eRampage code would be updated in order to resolve the issues with the enemies, as well as resolving some of the game-breaking issues. But unfortunately it was not, and in the end, this port ended up staying on my DevKit as unreleased software. Postal is a game by Running with Scissors that was released for DOS-based computers in the 90s. Since then, Postal has become open source, I believe, in 2011. Now, I did a port of Postal to the Nintendo Switch about a month ago. Now, some people with a sharp eye saw that I was working on a Postal port for the original Xbox in a previous video. Postal by Running with Scissors became open source in 2011. Even though I released the Nintendo Switch port a few weeks ago, my first attempt was actually for the original Xbox. While at first glance, this port looks and runs great, it still needs some serious work. This port uses SDL2, which is not available for the original Xbox, so I've had to take the time to convert all SDL2 code to SDL 1.2 that is available for the original Xbox. This in turn has illustrated some significant issues with the controller and twin stick support, and it doesn't work very well at all. For this port, while I don't think I'll ever get around to finishing it, I will probably package up the source code and release it so some active original Xbox Homebrew dev can take a look at it and finish it off. So there you have it, guys, my unreleased ports on my DevKit for the Xbox 360 and the original Xbox. Now, this is part one of a two-part series with the second part coming out at a later date. I do have more things that I haven't showed you guys yet, so stick around for that in a future episode. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed this look at what's on my DevKit and some of the unreleased things that I worked on. I thought it was interesting. You know, I did a viewer poll on this on the community tab on my YouTube channel, and I got a lot of responses back saying, let's take a look and see what's unreleased out there. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments below if you have any questions about what you saw in this video or anything else. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.